The casserole dish was still warm when my mother called to tell me she wouldn't be coming. My name is Patricia. I'm 34 years old, a high school English teacher, and 3 days before that phone call I had identified my husband's body in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Michael had been driving home from a late meeting when a truck ran a red light on Mercer Street. He died before the ambulance arrived. Our daughter Emma was 7 years old and asleep in her bed when I got the call, and I had sat on the kitchen floor for 40 minutes before I could make myself stand up and go check on her. My mother's voice on the phone was careful, measured. The voice she used when she had already decided something and needed me to accept it without making it difficult. Patricia, sweetheart, you know how much we love you. But Madison planned this brunch months ago, and the reservations can't be changed, and you have so many people around you already. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone with one hand and a dish towel with the other. Through the window I could see my neighbor Ruth crossing the yard with the casserole she'd made, head down against the November wind. The funeral is Saturday, I said. I know, honey. We'll come by Sunday. We'll make it right. I didn't say anything for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Emma was upstairs, and I could hear the faint sound of her moving around her room. The particular restless movement of a child who is old enough to understand something terrible has happened but too young to know what to do with that understanding. Okay, I said finally. I hung up and let Ruth in and ate 2 bites of the casserole and then sat at the table for a long time after she left, looking at the stack of Michael's papers on the counter that I hadn't been able to move yet. That was the first moment I should have understood what was coming. Not the grief, I was already inside the grief, had been living in it for 72 hours. Something else. A specific chill, separate from the cold November air, that I filed away without examining because I was 34 years old and my husband was dead and I didn't have the capacity for anything additional. I would find the capacity soon enough. Let me tell you about my family before I tell you what they did, because context is the thing that makes a story true rather than simply painful. My parents, Diane and Gerald, had 2 daughters separated by 4 years. I was the older one, the reliable one, the one who got good grades without requiring tutoring and managed her own problems without requiring intervention and made sensible decisions that never embarrassed anyone. Madison was younger, softer, more immediately appealing in the way of people who have learned, very early, that being appealing is its own form of power. The favoritism was not dramatic. That's the thing about this particular family dynamic, it doesn't announce itself. It accumulates, quietly, over years, in the texture of small decisions. Which daughter's school events got both parents present and which got one? Which daughter's crises got immediate phone calls and which got "we'll talk about it at Sunday dinner"? Which daughter's achievements were mentioned to relatives and which were mentioned in passing, if at all? I had absorbed this so completely by the time I reached adulthood that I had stopped interpreting it as favoritism and started interpreting it as simple fact. I was the one who didn't require much. I was strong. I was capable. I was fine. Michael had seen it differently. This was one of our recurring gentle disagreements. Michael believed my parents' treatment of me was something worth naming and I believed it was something worth managing. He would raise an eyebrow after a family dinner where my mother had spent 45 minutes discussing Madison's latest crisis and approximately 3 minutes on anything related to my life. I would shrug and say it was just how things were. It's how things are allowed to be, he said once, not unkindly. There's a difference. I told him he was being uncharitable. Looking back now, I understand that he was being precise. Michael was 37 when he died. He taught high school history at the school across town from mine, which is where we had met 11 years ago at a faculty mixer where neither of us particularly wanted to be. He was the kind of man who brought coffee to every early morning he attended, always made extra, always remembered how other people took it. He kept a running notebook of Emma's funny pronunciations of words so we could show her when she was older. He renewed our lease a month early every year because he hated the uncertainty of the last week. He was also, I would discover in the weeks after his death, the kind of man who had prepared for the worst with the specific thoroughness of someone who had paid close attention to the world around him, including the people in my family who I had spent years choosing not to examine too carefully. The funeral was on Saturday. My parents did not come. They arrived Sunday afternoon as promised, with a grocery store flower arrangement and the particular manner of people who have prepared a narrative about a difficult situation and need you to accept it. My father handled the flowers while my mother handled me, touching my arm, asking about Emma, steering around the Saturday absence with the dexterity of someone who has steered around difficult topics before. "We're here now," she said. "That's what matters." I let it go. This was my mistake, identifiable, specific, the kind of mistake I had been making for 34 years without understanding that letting things go is not the same as resolving them. I let it go because I was exhausted and because Emma needed me and because the effort of addressing it felt like more than I had available. 3 days later, they called about the money. Not immediately, there was a preamble. How was I sleeping? How was Emma eating? Had I spoken to the school about bereavement leave? The conversation had the structure of genuine concern and the texture of something else, something that was waiting for its moment. My father cleared his throat. "We've been thinking," he said, "about Michael's estate." Something inside me went very still. "Patricia, you're going to be overwhelmed with managing everything on your own. The house, the accounts, Emma's schooling, it's a lot for one person. And Madison's business is at a critical point right now, and your mother and I have been thinking about retirement." "Dad," I said. "Just hear me out. 50%. That's all we're asking. Family takes care of family, and you have more than enough to." I set the phone down on the counter without hanging up. I could hear his voice continuing, distant and slightly tinny, while I stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the bare November trees. Emma came downstairs in her socks, holding the stuffed rabbit Michael had given her for her 6th birthday. She looked at the phone on the counter and then at my face. "Is something wrong, Mama?" she said. "No, baby," I said. "Go pick your pajamas. I'll be up in a minute." I picked up the phone. "I need to think," I told my father. Of course. Take your time." I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long time after Emma went back upstairs. The house was very quiet. Michael's reading glasses were still on the side table in the living room, exactly where he'd left them the morning he died, because I hadn't been able to make myself move them. I hadn't been able to make myself move anything of his yet. I didn't ask myself, that night, why my parents had waited exactly 3 days after the funeral they hadn't attended to make this request. I told myself there was probably an innocent explanation, that grief made people say clumsy things, that financial anxiety could make even good people reach for something solid. I was generous with explanations I hadn't been asked to provide. That generosity had a very long history. The calls began to come regularly after that. Not every day, strategically spaced, the way pressure is applied when someone wants you to feel it without being able to name it as pressure. My mother on Tuesday with gentle expressions of concern that contained, somewhere in their middle section, a reference to the inheritance. My father on Thursday with more direct language about what would be fair to the whole family. Madison called once. She was warmer than our parents, she usually was, and she said she hoped I was doing okay and that she wasn't part of whatever conversation our parents were having. She said it with the specific detachment of someone who wants to believe they are outside a situation they are actually embedded in. I believed her. That was my second mistake. Michael's lawyer was a woman named Andrea who had drawn up our will 2 years earlier, the kind of thorough, undramatic professional who sent reminder emails about document updates and kept impeccable files. She called me the week after the funeral to schedule an appointment, and her voice had the careful quality of someone who has significant information and is managing the timing of its delivery. We met in her office on a Thursday. The room smelled like good coffee and the particular neutral calm of a professional environment designed to contain difficult conversations. Emma was at school. I had driven there in the strange detached state that had become my default, the state in which I functioned, performed all necessary tasks, and felt slightly removed from myself, as if watching from a small distance. Andrea set a folder on the desk between us. "Michael updated several documents 8 months ago," she said. "I want to walk you through everything, but I also want to tell you up front, he was thorough. More thorough than most clients I work with." She opened the folder. The will was detailed and unambiguous. The house, the accounts, the investments, everything came to me and then in trust to Emma. There were specific provisions about Emma's education, about the management of the estate, about the conditions under which any of it could be accessed. It was airtight in the specific way of a document prepared by someone who had anticipated challenges. He also left a letter, Andrea said. She slid an envelope across the desk. It was sealed. My name was on the front in Michael's handwriting, the particular handwriting I had seen on shopping lists and birthday cards and lesson plans for 11 years. He asked that you read it at home. Not here. I held the envelope without opening it. Is there anything else? I asked. Andrea hesitated. He left a second sealed envelope. He asked that it be given to Emma, to be opened by her when she felt it was right. She paused. He was very specific about that. I drove home with both envelopes on the passenger seat. I didn't open mine until Emma was asleep, 11:30, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, the house making its nighttime sounds around me. Michael's letter was 4 pages, handwritten, in the deliberate script he used for things that mattered. He had written it, he said, because he had watched my family for 11 years and understood something I had spent 34 years declining to understand. He named it plainly and without cruelty. He described specific incidents, the missed events, the comparative treatment, the slow accumulation of evidence that my parents operated according to a hierarchy in which I was not at the top. He said he was not writing this to make me angry but to make sure I was prepared, because he had a feeling, he wrote that, a feeling, which was so characteristic of him that I had to stop reading for a moment, that if something happened to him, the people who had spent years taking the least from me would try to take the most. He had spoken to Andrea. He had structured everything to make that as legally difficult as possible. At the bottom of the 4th page, he had written, "You are not someone who needs protecting, Patty. But everyone deserves someone in their corner. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm there in everything else I could think to do." I sat at the table for a long time after I finished reading. The specific grief of that moment was different from the grief of the 3 weeks before it, not larger, but more complex. I was grieving Michael and simultaneously receiving him, in the form of 4 handwritten pages that demonstrated, with the thoroughness he brought to everything, how clearly he had seen the situation I had spent years insisting was manageable. Looking back now, I understand that his letter was also a kind of diagnosis. Not of my parents, of me. Of the years I had spent being the daughter who didn't require much, who let things go, who called herself strong and called it a quality rather than a cope. He had seen through the armor with the gentle patience of someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth about it. The calls from my parents continued. My mother added a new element, references to the difficulty of watching me struggle, to how much it hurt her not to be able to help more. The pain in her voice sounded genuine. It probably was genuine, in the way that people can be genuinely pained by a situation they are simultaneously creating. My father called Andrea's office directly. She told me this without editorial comment, but I noticed a particular quality in her voice when she said it, a controlled professional neutrality covering something closer to contempt. He asked about the terms of the will, she said. I told him I couldn't discuss a client's estate without authorization. He called back twice. He called back twice, I repeated. Yes. Something shifted in me then. Not anger, not yet. Something more structural. The sensation of a piece moving into place. I asked Andrea what options they had, legally, to contest the will. She walked me through it. The grounds were narrow. Michael had been meticulous. There was, however, one avenue they might attempt, a challenge based on the trust structure and the argument that the provisions were not in Emma's best interests. They would need standing, Andrea said. And they would need to demonstrate that Emma's interests are not being served by the current arrangement. They'll try, I said. Andrea nodded. Probably. People in this situation usually do. I drove to pick up Emma from school that afternoon and watched her come through the doors with her backpack bouncing and her face doing the particular thing it did when she'd had a good day, a brightness that still caught me off guard, that still looked so much like Michael that I sometimes needed a moment before I could respond normally. In the car, she asked if we could have hot chocolate. Yes, I said. Can we use the good mugs? Absolutely. We drove home. We made hot chocolate in the good mugs. Emma sat at the kitchen table and told me about a project involving the solar system, and I sat across from her and listened with the full attention of someone who understands, with a new and specific sharpness, what it means to be present. She still had the stuffed rabbit. She carried it everywhere now. I had noticed this but hadn't said anything, because some things children do in grief are not things you address, they're things you protect. The family lunch was my parents' idea. They framed it as reconciliation, a chance to sit down together, to talk through things calmly, to find a solution that worked for everyone. The language was so reasonable that I almost didn't notice what it was, an ambush constructed from reasonable language. They had invited relatives. My father's brother Tom, his wife Sarah. My mother's cousin Diane, a different Diane, older, who had known our family for decades. Several others. 8 people in total, gathered around my parents' dining room table on a Saturday afternoon under the pretense of supporting me through grief. I knew what it actually was when my mother called to confirm I was coming and mentioned, with careful casualness, that she hoped I was in a talking place. I'm always in a talking place, I said. I told Andrea. I told my neighbor Ruth, who had become, in the weeks since Michael's death, the closest thing I had to a daily support system, a 62-year-old retired librarian who brought food and stayed for tea and asked real questions and never once told me how to feel about anything. I had not told Ruth everything, but I told her about the lunch. Take Emma, Ruth said. It's not appropriate for Emma. Take Emma anyway, Ruth said. Children change the chemistry of a room. And your parents are less likely to perform if their granddaughter is present. I thought about it. Then I thought about Michael's letter, and about Andrea's description of my father calling her office twice, and about my mother's voice when she said we'll make it right, and I decided Ruth was correct. I also, on an instinct I couldn't fully articulate, told Emma the night before that we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's for lunch. Will there be people there? Emma asked. Some people, I said. She was quiet for a moment, doing the particular thinking face she had inherited from Michael, slightly narrowed eyes, the upper lip just barely pulled in. Daddy left me a letter, she said. I went very still. I know, baby. I've been keeping it, she said. In my rabbit. She squeezed the stuffed animal in her lap. He said I'd know when. I looked at her for a long moment. Do you think you know when? I said. She thought about it with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who has been sitting with something important. Tomorrow, she said. I think tomorrow. The dining room was full when we arrived. My mother had set the table for 10, with the good china she brought out for occasions that required a performance of normalcy. The flowers from the grocery store, different ones from the funeral week, were arranged in the center. Everyone stood when we came in, the small social choreography of a room full of people who have been told to expect a difficult conversation and are preparing their faces accordingly. My parents greeted Emma first. They always did, which was the one consistent warmth I had never questioned. Whatever their failures with me, they loved Emma without condition, and watching my mother hold her was always complicated, the genuine tenderness of it sitting alongside everything else. We ate. The conversation was managed, careful, surface level, the particular texture of a meal where everyone knows the real subject is being held for after dessert. It came over coffee. My father set his cup down with a deliberateness that the table registered. Conversation quieted. Patricia, he said. We wanted to get everyone together because we think family decisions should involve family. What happens with Michael's estate affects all of us. We want to talk about how we move forward in a way that's fair. I looked at him. 50%, my mother said, more quietly, filling in the number my father had left floating. That's all. Patricia, you have more than enough to raise Emma comfortably. Madison needs support right now. Madison's business has been struggling for 2 years, my father said. And your mother and I, we're not getting younger. This is what family is for. Tom, my father's brother, shifted in his seat. Sarah, beside him, was looking at the table. I had not planned what I did next. Or perhaps I had planned it without knowing I was planning it, in the way that decisions made by the whole body sometimes arrive before the mind has formally consented to them. I looked at Emma, who was sitting beside me with the stuffed rabbit in her lap. She looked back at me. Then she reached into the rabbit, through a small opening in the seam at the back that I hadn't known was there, and pulled out a folded envelope. The table went very quiet. Emma set the envelope in front of me. It had her name on the front in Michael's handwriting. "Daddy said there would be a right time," she said. I picked it up. I looked at my father and then at my mother and then at Tom and Sarah and the cousin Diane and the other assembled relatives who had been gathered as audience for a performance that was about to go in a direction no one had anticipated. "May I?" I said, to no one specifically. No one said anything. I opened the envelope. Michael had written Emma's letter in simpler language than mine, shorter sentences, warmer, the voice of a father writing to a 7-year-old who might read this at 7 or at 17 or at 25, whenever she needed it. He told her she was loved beyond measure. He told her she was brave. He told her that her mother was the most capable person he had ever known and that Emma should trust her completely. And then, in the final paragraph, he addressed the situation he had anticipated with the same thorough precision he had brought to everything else. "Emma, sweetheart, if there's ever a moment when someone tries to take what belongs to you and your mom, I want you to know that I thought about this. I made sure everything was protected. There is also a recording, Mama knows where to find it, of a phone call from the day of my funeral. The people on that call made choices that tell you a lot about who they are. Your mom will know what to do with it." I folded the letter. I looked at my mother. Her face had done something I had never seen it do, a complete failure of the managed expression, the practiced composure. She looked, for one unguarded moment, like someone who has just understood that they are in a different story than the one they thought they were in. "He recorded the phone call," I said. "Not as accusation. As statement of fact. The one on Saturday. Where you told me you weren't coming to his funeral." My father's hands, on the table, were very still. "Patricia. You can contest the will," I said. "Andrea has told me what that looks like. I want you to understand that I have the recording, I have Michael's letter, and I have a lawyer who has been preparing for this possibility since Michael first called her 8 months ago." Tom spoke for the first time. "Gerald." His voice was quiet but had a quality I recognized, the voice of a man addressing a situation he finds genuinely shameful. "What did you do?" The room held itself in a particular suspension, the suspended moment that comes when a conversation has traveled irreversibly past the point where it can be redirected back to normal. My mother recovered first, which was characteristic. She was better under pressure than my father, who went pale and looked at his hands. She reached across the table with the particular gesture she used when she needed to manage me, the hand-on-arm move, the voice dropping to something intimate, designed to make the conversation feel private even when it was public. "Patricia, sweetheart, this is getting out of hand. Michael left a recording because he misunderstood our intentions." "He understood them clearly," I said. "That's why he made it. We were just." "You missed his funeral," I said. "You had months to change the restaurant reservation and you chose not to. 3 days after the burial you called to ask for 50% of what he left Emma and me." I stopped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. Several decisions. The cousin Diane, the older one, my mother's cousin, set her fork down slowly. She had the face of a woman assembling information into a conclusion she didn't want to reach. "Diane," my mother said, using her name quickly, attempting to recruit her. "You understand how these family situations." "I understand," the older Diane said carefully, "that this woman buried her husband 10 days ago and you're sitting at your dining room table asking for her inheritance." My mother's composure underwent a second and more serious failure. Tom pushed back from the table slightly. Not dramatically, just the physical language of a man creating distance from something he wants no part of. Sarah's hand found his arm. My father, who had been silent for several minutes, looked up. His face had the specific expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just been relieved of it, not through resolution but through exposure, the particular lightning of a person whose secret has been located and can therefore no longer be managed. We made mistakes, he said. His voice was quieter than I'd heard it. I know that. Gerald, my mother said. We missed the funeral, he said, not to me but to the table, to the assembled relatives who had been brought here as reinforcement and had become instead an audience for a different kind of reckoning. We missed it for a birthday brunch. And then we asked Patricia for money. And I called her lawyer's office. He stopped. I called twice. Sarah inhaled audibly. My mother's hands were on the table, very still. 2 spots of color had appeared high on her cheeks. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not crying now, but something in her face had collapsed, the architecture of the managed presentation, the careful surface she had maintained for decades. I want you to understand something, I said. I looked at my mother specifically, because she was the one whose actions I had spent 34 years interpreting as love rather than as management. I am not doing this because I'm angry. I'm doing this because Emma is sitting at this table and she deserves to see what it looks like when someone protects what belongs to her. Emma, beside me, was holding her rabbit with both hands and watching with the focused attention of a child who understands she is witnessing something significant. The will contest, I continued, is something you're welcome to pursue. Andrea has prepared for it. The recording has been archived. Michael's letter is documented. I paused. Or you can choose not to. That would be a different kind of choice, and I'd recognize it as such. The room was very quiet. My father nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has been shown, without excess drama, the full ledger of what he has done. Madison, I realized, had not been invited to the lunch. My parents had not told her, apparently, or she had declined to come, which would have required a level of self-awareness about the situation I wasn't sure she possessed. Either way, her absence was its own information. Tom stood up. He did it without announcing it, simply rose from his chair and came to where I was sitting and put his hand briefly on my shoulder. Call me if you need anything, he said. I mean that. Sarah followed. Then the cousin Diane, who paused beside my mother's chair and said, very quietly, something I didn't fully hear, only the tone of it, which was not warm. One by one the room emptied until it was just the 4 of us, my parents at their end of the table, Emma and me at ours. My mother was crying now. Quietly, with the contained quality of someone who has not cried in front of others for a long time and has lost the practice of it. Even now, thinking about that moment, I find it the most complicated part of the whole story. Because the tears were real. She was genuinely distressed. And I had to hold 2 true things at once, that her pain was real, and that the pain I had been carrying for 34 years was also real, and that the existence of one did not erase or excuse the other. I don't know what we were thinking, she said finally. The we included and maybe also deflected. The habit of decades. I know what you were thinking, I said. You were thinking I was the strong one. That I would manage. That I always manage. I looked at her. You've been thinking that my whole life. She didn't answer. Which was, in its way, the most honest thing she could have done. I helped Emma with her jacket. I folded Michael's letter back into the envelope and put it in my bag. I thanked my parents for lunch in the tone I used for things I was not thanking anyone for, and I took my daughter out into the gray November afternoon and put her in the car and drove home. Emma was quiet until we were almost there. Mama, she said. Yeah, baby. Daddy was right, she said. You knew what to do. I kept my eyes on the road. He helped, I said. I know, she said. But so did you. The will contest was filed and withdrawn within 6 weeks. Andrea had anticipated this. The grounds were insufficient, the documentation was thorough, and the recording, Michael's archived record of my mother's Saturday phone call, made on a device he had set up specifically for this purpose and explained in a supplementary note to Andrea, would have been devastating in any legal context. My parents' attorney, according to Andrea, had advised them strongly against proceeding. They had listened. My father called me the week after the withdrawal. He said he was sorry. He said it without preamble, without the elaborate explanations and contextualizations that had characterized every previous difficult conversation we'd had. Just, "I'm sorry, Patricia. For Saturday and for all of it." I told him I heard him. I didn't tell him it was enough, because I wasn't sure yet whether it was. The accounting of 34 years is not something that resolves in a single phone call, however genuine. My mother's apology came in a letter, which was more her form, 3 pages, careful, the language of someone who has spent considerable time choosing words. She wrote about her own childhood and her own mother and the patterns she had absorbed without examining. I read it twice and then put it in a drawer. Not to discard, to hold until I knew what to do with it. Madison called in December. She had found out about the lunch from Tom. Apparently, he had called her the same evening with the kind of directness that I had come to understand was characteristic of him. Madison sounded, on the phone, like someone who had recently had several difficult realizations in rapid succession and had not fully finished processing any of them. "I didn't know about the will contest," she said. "I want you to know that. They didn't tell me." "I believe you," I said. "I also want you to know that I never asked them to do any of it. The money, the call, any of it." "I believe that too." A pause. "I'm sorry, Patricia. For what it's worth." "It's worth something," I said. Which was honest. We weren't close after that. Not the way sisters can be close when they've grown up on equal ground. But we were something, careful, tentative, the beginning of a relationship built on what was actually true rather than what had been convenient to believe. The church community, which had known my parents for 20 years, registered what had happened with the particular efficiency of small communities that value loyalty and witness its absence. Several families who had been close to my parents created a subtle but legible distance. No confrontations, just the specific social withdrawal of people who have recalculated a relationship. My parents felt it. They mentioned it once, to me, in a tone that wanted sympathy and received instead a silence they had to sit with. Emma continued carrying the rabbit. At Christmas, she showed me the opening in the seam where Michael's letter had been stored. "He must have put it in there when he fixed the leg," she said. The rabbit's left leg had needed reattaching in September, 2 months before the accident. Michael had done it one evening while Emma was at her friend's house. "He planned it," I said. She smoothed the rabbit's ear with the particular care she brought to loved objects. "He said I'd know when. And I did. I started therapy in January. Not because I was falling apart, I was, in fact, more structurally intact than I had expected, but because I understood that the version of myself that had spent 34 years being the strong one who didn't need much was not a version I wanted to take forward unchanged. There was work to do on that. Real work, the kind that doesn't have a clean endpoint. My therapist was a woman named Claudia who had a practice near the school and who said, in our first session, something that stayed with me: "The people who tell you that you're strong often do so because it relieves them of the obligation to support you. It's worth asking which it is." I thought about that for a long time. Ruth remained a constant. She came for tea on Thursdays and sometimes on Sundays and asked questions that required real answers and listened to the real answers without redirecting them toward comfort. She had known grief. Her husband had died 6 years earlier, and she knew that what grief needs most is not to be resolved but to be accompanied. Spring came slowly. Emma finished 2nd grade and started the summer with the particular resilience of children, not unaffected, not unchanged, but forward-moving in the organic way that children move when they are sufficiently held. She talked about Michael matter-of-factly, the way children talk about things they are processing, sometimes at dinner, sometimes in the car, sometimes at the edge of sleep. She had started drawing. Michael's reading glasses were still on the side table. I hadn't moved them. I had decided, at some point, that I didn't need to, that keeping them there was not an inability to move forward but a choice about what moving forward could look like. The inheritance was invested carefully, with Andrea's guidance and the assistance of a financial advisor Michael had recommended in his letter. The house was ours. Emma's education was secured. What I needed to do, financially, was manage well, not brilliantly, not without support, but with the informed attention of someone who had both the resources and, finally, the will to treat herself as someone worth protecting. I did not think about my parents constantly. That is the part one want to be honest about, because the story of family betrayal often ends with a kind of sustained drama, ongoing bitterness, vigilant distance, the protagonist defined by what was done to her. That was not what happened. What happened was quieter, a gradual reorganization, a reorientation toward the people and things that had proven themselves real. Tom and Sarah came for dinner in April. Ruth was there. Emma helped with the salad and showed Tom how to properly set the table and argued cheerfully about whether the forks went on the left or the right. The house was warm. The reading glasses were on the side table. At the end of the evening, after Tom and Sarah had left and Ruth had walked home across the yard, Emma fell asleep on the couch and I sat in the armchair across from her and looked at my daughter in the lamplight, her father's jaw, her father's way of sleeping with one hand open, and felt something that I can only describe as the specific piece of someone who has come through something and arrived somewhere real. Michael had known, when he prepared those letters and made those arrangements, that I was capable of this. He had said so. He had also understood, with the particular clarity of someone who loves you without needing you to be anything other than what you are, that capable is not the same as alone. I wasn't alone. That was the thing he had given me, not just the legal protection, not just the documentation, but the proof, in 4 handwritten pages, that someone had seen me completely. Had seen the armor and the genuine strength underneath it and the very real need beneath both. Had prepared, carefully and with great love, for the moment when I would need to know that. I understood, sitting in that lamplit room, that I had spent most of my life confusing endurance with sufficiency. I had endured a lot. I had called it strength and it was, in part, strength, but endurance without witness is just survival. What Michael had given me was witness. And what I was building now, slowly, with Ruth and Tom and Sarah and Claudia and eventually, carefully, with Emma, was something closer to actually living. People who believe they are generous often mistake control for care. Diane and Gerald did not think of themselves as people who would abandon their daughter in her worst week and then ask her for money. They thought of themselves as practical people making a difficult situation work for the family. This distinction, between what people do and how they narrate what they do, is the engine at the center of this story, and it is what makes the betrayal so specifically damaging. The funeral absence was the moment of maximum exposure. Not because it was the worst thing they did, arguably the will contest was more instrumentally harmful, but because it stripped away all the language of love and practicality and revealed, in its plainest form, the hierarchy that had governed the family for 34 years. When the choice was between being present for Patricia's most significant loss and attending a birthday brunch for Madison, the choice they made told Patricia everything about where she had always ranked. They chose, and the choice was legible. What the story traces, underneath the legal and financial conflict, is Patricia's long process of updating a belief she had held since childhood, that being the strong one was a quality she possessed rather than a role she had been assigned because it was convenient for others. This belief had allowed the family dynamic to persist for decades without being named. Patricia had not been deceived, exactly, she had been a participant in a comfortable fiction that required her to minimize herself continuously in order to maintain the family's surface equilibrium. Michael's preparations were not just legally strategic. They were emotionally corrective. By documenting what he had observed, by anticipating exactly the behavior his in-laws would exhibit, he forced Patricia into contact with a reality she had spent years softening. His letter did not present new information so much as it refused her the option of continuing to explain it away. This is why the letter landed so heavily, not because it surprised her, but because it removed her last available excuse for remaining unaware. The question of Patricia's culpability in her own diminishment is the one the story engages with most honestly. She was not naive. She was, as the story consistently shows, intelligent and professionally capable and perceptive in almost every context except this one. What she had was a specific trained blindness, the kind that develops not from stupidity but from the survival necessity of making a difficult family relationship functional. Asking her why she didn't see it sooner is like asking someone why they didn't notice the wallpaper in their childhood home. It was simply the context. It was the air. The child's moment with the letter is the story's structural heart because it completes a reversal, Michael, who could not protect Patricia in person, had arranged for protection to arrive through the most unexpected and emotionally significant possible channel, their daughter. Emma's delivery of the letter was not planned in the sense of being choreographed. It was the result of Michael trusting Emma to know the right moment, and Emma, with the uncanny precision of children, being correct. The letter passed through the smallest and most loved person in the room and arrived with a weight that nothing adult could have replicated. What happens to the parents at the end is neither full redemption nor clean consequence. The apologies are real and insufficient simultaneously. The relationship that emerges from the story is honest, limited contact, maintained distance, the careful architecture of a connection that can exist without requiring Patricia to minimize herself further. This is not a triumphant ending. It is a realistic one. Some relationships cannot be repaired. They can only be renegotiated into something smaller and more honest. What I keep coming back to, thinking about this story, is a very small detail: Michael's reading glasses, still on the side table at the end. Patricia never moved them. That choice says more than any confrontation scene. It says, I am not erasing what was. I am building on it. I am taking what was real and carrying it forward rather than managing my grief into a shape that's easier for other people to look at. The people who told Patricia she was strong, who relied on that strength, who used it as permission not to show up, they never asked what it cost her. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe that question would have required a kind of self-examination they weren't equipped for. But Michael asked. He paid attention. And in paying attention, he gave her something that outlasted him. That's the thing about being truly seen by someone: it doesn't stop when they leave. It stays in the room. It stays in a letter tucked inside a stuffed rabbit, waiting for the right moment.